Hola chicos, we have chapter 26, Triumph of the Middle Class. We're going to be focusing on the middle class a lot. 1945 to 1963, we'll look at the post-war economy, talk about culture, and see some similarities to the 1920s, the family as well, and then finish it up with society itself. So let's go ahead and get right started with the post-war economy. So after World War II, the United States and the world creates the World Bank. That's right at the end of World War II. And the World Bank was meant to provide loans to war-torn European countries and other third world countries to help them recover and keep them away from communism. We also have the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, which was used to stabilize currencies worldwide, and that was based on US currency. So the dollar compared to, for example, the peso or the yen or any other currency. Now, the economic prosperity in the US was based on this concept here. Make sure you know that. Military industrial complex. Basically all it is, industries that benefited from government contracts for military supplies. Even though the war is over, World War II, we have the Cold War, and that is the driving force of our economy. So our economy depended on a robust defense sector. The United States did not want to go to war with the Soviet Union, but it needed to be prepared in case it did. And you notice this chart here, 1945, that's when the war ends. We have a big drop in spending, but then by the time the Korean War begins, we start spending more money again. It drops and then it goes up again to the Vietnam War and all the way to 1991, more or less, when the Cold War officially ends. So that's part of the conflict with the Soviet Union. On October 1957, the Soviet Union launches the first satellite in space that becomes known as Sputnik 1. It completely freaks out the Americans. And so now the Americans are ready to spend more money on military weapons. That becomes known as the arms race, and on space exploration as well. That becomes known as space race. And of course, soon after Sputnik 1 was launched, the Soviet Union also put the first men out in orbit, out in space. And that completely freaks out the United States even more. So eventually, while initially Congress did not want to fund money under the Truman administration for education, under the Eisenhower administration, they passed the National Defense Education Act of 1958, which was money for colleges that were going to be investing on science, math, and research. So defense, the Cold War, also drives education. After World War II, we have these GIs that come home, and some of them are starting to wonder, like the poster here, should they go back to college, because some of them didn't have a college education. So the GI Bill was meant to do exactly that, help World War II veterans purchase homes and attend colleges. Now, by attending colleges and having a higher education, that led to better jobs, which led to higher wages. So that middle class was the foundation as well of the Cold War prosperity, Cold War economic prosperity, and it was the driving force for economic boom during the Cold War for Americans. Right around this time as well, unions, they fight for collective bargaining. So collective bargaining becomes the acceptable method to settle disputes between employees and employers, and unions were able to be victorious by winning paid holidays, longer vacations, pension plans when you retire, and also healthcare insurance. Remember, under Truman, again, Congress did not pass healthcare insurance, so private companies with union help were finally able to accomplish that. We also see that during the 1940s, 1950s, we have an productivity surplus. So the United States is producing more goods than they're actually being able to consume. So we have a productivity chart here that shows again how much more production the United States is making. And what are they producing? Well, a big chunk of it is actually homes. In 1943, only about 43% of Americans had their own homes. 20 years later, in 1963, about 63% of Americans have an increase. So there was a 20% increase in home ownerships in a span of 20 years. And of course, once you buy your home, you also need to fill that home with different gadgets and appliances. So for example, you might buy your refrigerator, you might buy your stove, or you actually are going to buy your stove. You're going to buy your washer and dryer as well, a new lawnmower, especially the mechanized lawnmowers. They actually improve the economy. We also have a new car here, 1957's Bel Air, and television. So obviously, if people are consuming these items, there have to be people to produce them. And in the 1950s, 1960s, most of these items were being produced in the United States. So consumption was based on demand, and there was a lot of demand for a lot of these domestic products, and as such, there was a lot of jobs. So people bought the items that people were building here in the United States. Talking about TV, we're going to focus on that in the next couple of slides. So notice this big change. In 1950, only 9% of all Americans had a TV. Only 13 years later, in 1963, 91% of Americans had a TV at home. However, just because you have a product, it doesn't mean that you're necessarily satisfied with that product. So these products needed to improve. So on this next chart here, we have color television. By 1964, only 3% of households had a color television. 14 years later, 78% of households had television, color television. So we see that it's not just about making more products, but also about making that product a little bit more quality. So we continue to see the growth of consumption here in the United States. Talking about television, we're going to stay with it. Television becomes a huge marketing tool for advertisements. Advertisements was being used to push people to buy and consume different products. A lot of this consumption was based on the middle class. Remember, that is part of our major theme. Overwhelmingly, television was Anglo-Saxon, meaning white, Protestant in faith, suburban families, traditional family role, and middle class. So people that are living on the outskirts of town, people where there is a husband and a wife and maybe 2 kids, that was the traditional family, traditional role where the father went to work, the wife stayed at home doing traditional housework. And television also reflected that. So we have different TV shows to show that. Leave It to Beaver was one of them, where the husband went to work on a nice suit and a briefcase and on his brand new car, and the wife stayed at home. Now, I Love Lucy was a little bit different. Yes, we do have the husband who's going to work, and the wife Lucy stays home. But the husband here, Ricardo, he is a Cuban immigrant, which is important because what happened in Cuba, we have the Cuban Revolution in 1959. So Cubans start to flee Cuba and come into the United States, and some of them make it to the mainstream. A lot of the Cubans ended up in Miami, and they actually prospered because the Cubanos that left Cuba were middle class and had money. There were other immigrants that were coming at this time, the 1950s. We have the Bracero program as well, where, remember, during World War II, Mexicans were allowed to come into the United States, harvest crops. After the war, the Bracero movement was expanded because of the Cold War. And by the time the Bracero program ends in 1964, a lot of Mexicans made the United States a permanent home. So we do have Mexican people also settling in. And then we also have Puerto Ricanos, who are settling in the United States also because they are in search of industrial jobs, in particular in the defense systems. So they are settling in major cities like New York. So we start seeing also different ethnic neighborhoods that are spreading all across major cities like Miami, like LA, like New York, in different forms of immigration as well. So we start seeing a huge wave of immigrants as well. All these 3 groups are all Spanish speaking, but they all come from different backgrounds and different cultures. Now, we also have religion here. So church membership, like everything else in America in the 1950s, increased. People wanted to feel closer to God. They wanted to feel some form of religious affiliation. So they start attending church. Billy Graham becomes America's priest or America's evangelist. He was a Protestant, and he uses television as his method of advertising his ideas and beliefs. So him, along with other evangelists who were giving speeches on television, become known as televangelists. Now, Billy Graham becomes a little bit different because during the 1950s, there is this prosperity. People are buying a lot of goods, homes, appliances, cars, and stuff like that. And for a good amount of time, it was believed that if you go after material goods, that you can't necessarily be a good Christian. But Billy Graham and other televangelists start to preach that Christians who live moral lives deserve material blessings, and as such, to a certain extent, it was kind of seen as a blessing from God. We continue to see the impact of religion in the nation and politics. In 1954, the phrase "under God" was added to the Pledge of Allegiance. 2 years later, in 1956, the phrase "In God We Trust" was also put in U.S. coins and U.S. currency as well. So television was not only used for consumption, it was also used for religion and faith as well. TV also has a major impact in terms of culture. So this is youth culture in particular. The youth culture of the 1950s, it doesn't really have a name. Some people call it the rocking 50s, kind of making it like the roaring 20s, but it doesn't have a permanent name per se. So the youth culture of the 1950s was actually rooted in the 1920s jazz culture. So in the 1920s, if you recall, we have the Flappers. In the 1950s, we have Billies. We have these rockabillys who are now taking charge of the culture. In the 1950s, in the 1920s, we have jazz. In the 1950s, we have rock and roll. The 1920s was an era of independence. And very same thing in the 1950s. Advertising become big. Advertisement is targeted at teens because teens have money and they want to spend that money, especially in the 1950s. We also have TV or films who also encouraged this youth culture. So James Dean, in particular, the movie A Rebel Without a Cause, and James Dean is up here in this poster. He is the guy that's on the bar. And also Marilyn Monroe. Notice what they have in common. They're both young and they're both beautiful, just like my AP students that are young and beautiful. And we also have rock and roll. Rock and roll. Elvis, also on this picture here, right behind Marilyn Monroe. I think he's checking her out. He sings a lot of his cover songs are actually based on African roots. So we also start to see the input of African culture in American mainstream. So while for the most part, white suburbia in the 1950s was predominantly white, we do see some influence of African Americans as well. And of course, who can forget the movie Grease, and also the different culture that was being expressed here in the movie as well, and it continues to have culture even today. So these hillbillies are what are leading the cultural revolution of the 1950s. Now, none of this would have been possible without the baby boom generation. So after the war, between 1945, as you can see in this chart, there was a huge increase of fertility. A lot of the soldiers that were returning home had a lot of catching up to do with their wives. Also, people married young and they had more children. Families were stable. There was actually a decrease of divorce in the 1950s and an increase of marriages. So we also see an impact here. Now, the baby boom generation comes to life in the 1950s, and they have a huge economic impact. In the 1950s, people were spending money buying baby products, such as diapers, toys, and clothing. In the 1960s, these baby boomers became teenagers, and they were spending money on music albums, such as the Beatles, such as Elvis, and movies as well. The 1970s, their parents were spending money on colleges. When they finally got out of colleges, these people got married, they bought their own homes, and they bought their own vehicles. In the 1980s, they competed for jobs and had their own children. And today in the 20th century, a lot of these baby boomers are retiring, so there's also a competition there for Social Security and who's going to get how much money. So it continues to have a big impact, the baby boomers. Let's look now at the role of women in the 1920s. So in the 1950s. The 1950s, the role of women was more of an updated version of the role of domesticity of the 19th century. Women, for the most part, were still considered to be wife and mothers. You see that in this picture here. So this wife here has all the new appliances, and you see the vehicle on the background as well. So she stayed home. However, there was an increasing number of women that did join the workforce. Women worked women's work, such as teaching, nursing, clerk, and the service sectors. They were also still required to work at home. So while they were underpaid at work, they were unpaid at home. Women worked 60% to that of men working the same jobs. But more and more families needed the women to work to stay up to the middle class mentality that the life demanded, such as buying a home, cars, vacations, and appliances. So the role of women as consumers were the major ones. They shop for the entire family, for themselves, for their kids, their babies, and also for the husbands. As more and more women got educated, they became more frustrated because when they went to apply for jobs, a lot of these jobs were closed to women simply for the fact that they were women. So we continue to see this paternalistic point of view in families.